Investigators remain committed to exploring all possibilities surrounding the children's disappearance. We want to thank all those who provided tips and information.
I mean, it's mysterious as it is because the distance from the garbage bin to where the blanket was found is almost 1 kilometer.
What if a $30 down payment on a horse trailer completely blew open one of the most significant cases in Canadian true crime? What if a person pretending to be a regular buyer of livestock gear went into a grandmother's house and captured audio that could change everything we thought we knew about 2 missing children? This isn't just another small update on a missing persons case. This isn't another press conference with no new information. This is about the moment when a web of lies, carefully woven over months, began to come apart with a single recording. Tonight, you're going to hear evidence that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the disappearance of 6-year-old Lilly Sullivan and 4-year-old Jack Sullivan from Nova Scotia. And before you move on, before you decide this is just another true crime story, let me tell you something that'll keep you here until the very end. The person who was meant to care for these children just admitted in his own words that evidence in this case was put there on purpose. The same man who's been sticking to one story for 3 months just contradicted himself so badly that even his biggest supporters are starting to step away. And the most troubling part? He doesn't even realize he's doing it. If you've been following this case, what you're about to hear will change how you see everything. If you're new here, you're about to witness something that doesn't happen often in true crime. You're about to watch a person of interest dismantle their own defense right before your eyes. This is the Lilly and Jack Sullivan case, and it just took a turn that nobody saw coming. Not the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, not the community volunteers who've been searching for these kids for months, and certainly not Daniel Martel, the stepfather whose story has more holes than a fishing net. But before we dive into that explosive audio, before we look at the contradictions that are piling up like evidence in a courtroom, you need to grasp something crucial about this case. You need to understand that what you're about to hear isn't just about 2 missing children from Nova Scotia. This is about how lies come undone. This is about how desperation makes people say things they never meant to. And this is about how the truth, no matter how deeply it's hidden, always finds a way to reveal itself. The recording we're going to talk about was obtained by a local volunteer who has been dedicating his time to finding Lilly and Jack. His name is Tint, and he's been using drones, organizing searches, doing everything possible to bring these children home. But what he captured with a simple recording device might be the breakthrough this case has been waiting for. Here's what happened. Someone pretending to be a potential customer went to the home of Cindy, the grandmother of Lilly and Jack Sullivan. They were interested in buying a horse trailer, a completely normal, innocent transaction. But what they recorded during that visit was anything but normal. They captured Cindy's boyfriend on tape making statements that directly conflict with everything Daniel Martel has been telling the public for months. Statements about improper treatment, statements about the living conditions in the home where these children lived, statements about visits from Child Protective Services that reportedly didn't lead to anything, and statements about financial issues that paint a picture of a household in complete disorder. But here's where it gets truly shocking. Daniel Martel, the man who has been declaring his innocence for months, the man who has been accusing others of lying, the man who has been telling anyone who will listen that he's being unfairly targeted, just released text messages that contradict his own story. In these messages, Daniel himself suggests that evidence in this case was placed. The very same evidence he previously confirmed belonged to Lilly, the very same evidence he and Malaya both identified as authentic. Now, suddenly, as the pressure mounts, as the inconsistencies become impossible to ignore, Daniel is changing his story again. He's asking questions like, who just happens to come across it, in reference to the pink blanket found near Gearlock Road. He's saying things like, a blanket doesn't grow wings, and we all know who put it there. These aren't the words of an innocent person sticking to their story. These are the words of someone who knows exactly how that evidence got there and is desperately trying to create a shadow of a doubt. What makes this even more troubling is the time frame. Daniel has had months to get his story straight. He's had access to lawyers. He's had time to think. He's had every chance to present a consistent account. Instead, what we're seeing is a pattern of lies that keep changing every time a new piece of evidence appears. Remember, we're talking about his stepchildren. We're talking about 6-year-old Lily and 3-year-old Jack Sullivan, who disappeared from their home in Nova Scotia and haven't been seen since. If you were innocent, if you truly didn't know what happened to these children, wouldn't your story stay the same? Wouldn't you be focused entirely on finding them instead of constantly defending yourself and lashing out at others? But Daniel's behavior tells a different story. Instead of staying focused on the missing children, he's been engaged in a months-long campaign of misdirection, shifting blame, and changing his story in a way that would be almost funny if it weren't so tragic. And now, with this new recording, with these latest text messages, with the mountain of contradictions that keeps growing, we're starting to see the real Daniel Martel. Not the devastated stepfather he's tried to appear as, but someone who may know far more about what happened to Lily and Jack than he's ever admitted. The question isn't whether Daniel is lying anymore. The evidence is overwhelming that he's been misleading people from the start. The question now is, what exactly is he lying about, and how deep does his involvement go? Stick with me, because what we're about to uncover together will shock you. We're going to look at every contradiction, every falsehood, every piece of evidence that Daniel himself has unknowingly provided. We're going to look at the timeline that doesn't add up, the activities that couldn't have happened the way he described them, and the statements that prove he knows more than he's saying. This isn't just another true crime narrative. This is a live examination of how lies unravel and how the truth emerges even when someone is desperately trying to keep it hidden. The horse trailer that began this flood of revelations was worth $30. $30. That's all it took to potentially break open one of Nova Scotia's most heartbreaking missing children cases. Think about that for a moment. For months, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police have been conducting one of the biggest search operations in recent maritime history. Hundreds of volunteers have spent countless hours combing through forests, checking abandoned buildings, and following up on tips. Professional investigators have been analyzing evidence, conducting interviews, and building timelines, and then a local volunteer with a $30 down payment and a recording device achieved something that might change everything. But before we get into the specifics of what was recorded, you need to understand the background. You need to understand who Cindy is and why this recording is so important. Cindy is the maternal grandmother of Lily and Jack Sullivan. She's the mother of Malaya, who was in a relationship with Daniel Martel when the children disappeared. Cindy would have had personal knowledge of the family dynamics, the living conditions, and the events leading up to the disappearance. Most importantly, she would have had no reason to lie to a stranger interested in buying a horse trailer. The volunteer who obtained this recording goes by the name Tint on social media. He's been one of the most dedicated individuals in the search for Lily and Jack, using drones to survey areas that would be difficult for ground teams to cover effectively. He's put in countless hours, not for fame or attention, but because he genuinely cares about finding these children and bringing them home safely. Tint's dedication to this case represents something beautiful about the Nova Scotia community. While Daniel Martel has been focused on defending himself and attacking his critics, regular citizens like Tint have been focused on what actually matters, finding Lily and Jack. So when Tint went to Cindy's home under the guise of buying a horse trailer, he wasn't doing it for social media content or personal gain. He was doing it because he suspected there might be information that hadn't come to light yet, information that could be vital to finding these missing children. What he recorded went beyond even his expectations. According to the audio obtained, Cindy's boyfriend made several explosive statements that directly conflict with the narrative Daniel Martel has been promoting for months. These weren't just casual comments or misremembered details. These were specific, detailed claims that paint a disturbing picture of the household where Lily and Jack were living before they disappeared. The first big revelation concerned Daniel's attitude toward the children. According to the recording, Cindy's boyfriend stated that Daniel didn't like the kids. Not that he was having trouble adjusting to being a stepfather, Not that there were normal challenges in a blended family situation, but that he actively disliked these children. This claim is especially damaging when you think about Daniel's public statements about his relationship with Lilly and Jack. He's consistently portrayed himself as a loving stepfather who was devastated by their disappearance. He's talked about activities they did together, about how much he cared for them, about how their loss has affected him. But if Cindy's boyfriend is telling the truth, that entire story falls apart. If Daniel genuinely disliked these children, it raises serious questions about his behavior toward them, his treatment of them, and ultimately what might have happened to them. The second major claim concerned mistreatment. The recording allegedly captures statements suggesting that Daniel was unkind toward the children. This isn't a vague accusation or a misunderstood interaction. According to what was captured, there were specific concerns about Daniel's treatment of Lilly and Jack that were known to family members. Again, this directly conflicts with everything Daniel has said publicly. He's never acknowledged any conflict with the children, any disciplinary issues, or any concerns about his parenting. He's presented himself as nothing but loving and supportive. If there were genuine concerns about mistreatment, it raises critical questions about why the children were still in his care and what steps, if any, were taken to address these issues before they disappeared. The third revelation concerns the condition of the home itself. According to the recording, the house was described as filthy, not just messy or lived in, but filthy. This suggests a level of neglect that goes far beyond normal household clutter or the chaos that can come with young children. We've seen cases before where children have been removed from homes due to unsanitary conditions. We've seen situations where the living environment itself posed a risk to the children's health and safety. If the Sullivan home was in this condition, it raises questions about why help didn't come sooner. The fourth major claim involves Child Protective Services. According to the recording, CPS visited the home in December, but apparently took no action. This is perhaps one of the most troubling revelations because it suggests that there were enough concerns to justify an official investigation, but whatever they found wasn't enough to remove the children from the home. This raises uncomfortable questions about the child protection system itself. Were the concerns properly looked into? Were the appropriate standards applied? Could Lilly and Jack still be alive today if different decisions had been made during that December visit? The final claim concerns financial issues. According to the recording, Daniel and Malaya allegedly used credit cards that didn't belong to them and accumulated charges. This paints a picture of a household where basic moral and legal boundaries were being crossed regularly. Financial misdeeds might seem small compared to missing children, but it's actually quite significant. It shows a willingness to break the law for personal gain. It shows a disregard for other people's property and rights. And it suggests that if Daniel and Malaya were willing to do something like that, what else might they have been willing to do? What makes all of these claims even more powerful is that they come from someone within the family circle. This isn't just speculation from outsiders or theories from internet detectives. This is allegedly first-hand knowledge from someone who would have been in a position to observe the family dynamics directly. But here's where the story takes an even more shocking turn. When faced with these revelations, when presented with evidence that contradicts his carefully built public image, Daniel Martel didn't deny the claims or provide alternative explanations. Instead, he did something that experienced investigators and true crime fans know is often a sign of a troubled conscience. He started attacking the messenger while simultaneously changing his own story about other parts of the case. If you're innocent, if someone is making false claims about you, your response is typically to provide proof of your innocence or to explain why the claims are wrong. You don't switch to other topics or start contradicting your own previous statements. But that's exactly what Daniel did. And in the process, he may have unknowingly provided the most damaging evidence against himself yet. What do you think about these allegations? Do they change how you feel about this case? Are you starting to see a pattern in Daniel's behavior? And most importantly, where do you think this leads us in the search for Lilly and Jack? because what happens next in this story will show you just how desperate Daniel has become and how his own words might be the key to finally getting clarity for these two innocent children. What happened next in the Daniel Martel story is something that criminal psychologists and behavioral analysts study. When someone who has been consistently lying for months suddenly faces evidence that conflicts with their story, they typically respond in one of two ways. They either come clean and admit the truth, or they double down and start making even more desperate claims. Daniel chose the second option. Instead of addressing the explosive claims captured in that horse trailer recording, instead of explaining why a family member would make such damaging statements about him, Daniel did something that reveals more about his guilt than any confession could. He started releasing new text messages that directly contradict statements he's made for months. Let me be clear about what this means. For almost 3 months, Daniel Martel has been telling a consistent story about certain aspects of this case. He's made specific claims about evidence, about timelines, about his own actions. These statements have been recorded, documented, and reported by multiple sources. Now, suddenly, as the pressure mounts and new claims are appearing, he's changing fundamental aspects of his story. Not minor details that might be explained by a poor memory or stress, but core elements of his defense. The first major contradiction concerns his attitude toward the investigation itself. For months, Daniel has been complaining that he's being treated unfairly, that he's being targeted unjustly, that the investigation is focused on him when it should be looking elsewhere. But in his recent messages, he made a statement that reveals he understands exactly why he's the focus of the investigation. He said there's no one else to target other than me and my mom because they hide. Think about what that statement reveals. He's not saying the investigation is wrong to focus on him, he's saying there's no alternative target because everyone else is hiding. This suggests that he knows there are other people who should be investigated, but they're not available or not cooperating. This is a significant shift from his previous position that he was being unfairly singled out. Now he's essentially admitting that he's the logical person of interest, just claiming it's by default rather than by evidence. The second major contradiction involves his statements about finding the children. Throughout this investigation, Daniel has claimed that his main concern is finding Lily and Jack, that everything he's doing is focused on bringing them home safely. But his recent messages tell a different story. Instead of focusing on search efforts or providing helpful information, he's been engaged in a sustained campaign of attacking critics and defending himself. His messages are filled with complaints about how he's being treated, not pleas for help in finding the children. When someone pointed out this contradiction, Daniel claimed, "I've been vocal since the start about finding the kids. We all decide, Lily and Jack are the only goal I have." But his actions don't match these words. If finding the children was truly his only goal, why is he spending so much time and energy on defensive messages? Why is he focused on his public image rather than cooperating fully with investigators? The third and perhaps most damaging contradiction involves the evidence found near Gearlock Road. This is where Daniel's changing story becomes absolutely devastating to his credibility. Back in June, when the Royal Canadian Mounted Police showed Daniel items found during the search, he confirmed that a blanket belonged to Lily. This confirmation was reported in multiple news sources. Both Daniel and Malaya identified the blanket as belonging to the missing girl. Daniel even made statements to the media saying there is more evidence than the public knows, suggesting that he was cooperating with the investigation and providing helpful information about the items found. But now, in his latest messages, Daniel is suggesting that this same evidence was placed there by someone else. He's asking questions like, who just happens to stumble upon it? And making statements like, a blanket doesn't grow wings, and we all know who planted it. This isn't a small inconsistency, this is a complete reversal of his previous position. He went from confirming the evidence was legitimate to suggesting it was a setup. What makes this contradiction even more significant is the specific language Daniel uses. When he says, "We all know who planted it," he's not speaking as someone who suspects evidence was placed there. He's speaking as someone who knows with certainty that it was. How would Daniel know this unless he was involved in placing the evidence there himself? Innocent people don't typically have detailed knowledge about how evidence came to be placed. They might suspect it or theorize about it, but they don't speak with the certainty that Daniel shows in his messages. The fourth contradiction involves the timeline of events leading up to the children's disappearance. Daniel has previously stated that everything was normal the night before Lily and Jack went missing, that Malaya put the children to bed as usual, and that he worked on outdoor projects with Malaya's mother. But now he's providing new details about these activities that don't make logical sense. He claims they were working on a fence and getting ready for a pool installation in early May in Nova Scotia. Anyone familiar with maritime weather patterns knows that early May in Nova Scotia is not pool weather. It's barely warm enough for extended outdoor work, let alone pool preparation. And most pools in the region don't even open until June at the earliest. This timeline inconsistency might seem minor, but it's actually quite significant. If Daniel is lying about what they were doing the night before the children disappeared, what else is he lying about? What were they actually doing that night that he doesn't want people to know? The fifth contradiction involves his claims about the investigation status. Daniel has alternated between calling this a criminal investigation and claiming it's not a criminal investigation, depending on which story serves his purposes at the moment. When he wants to complain about being treated like a person of interest, he emphasizes that this isn't officially a criminal investigation. When he wants to suggest that evidence is being built against him, he talks about it as if it were a criminal investigation. This kind of selective storytelling is typical of someone who is trying to control the narrative rather than simply telling the truth. Innocent people typically have a consistent understanding of their situation. They don't change their description of events based on what they're trying to argue at the moment. But perhaps the most revealing contradiction of all is Daniel's attitude toward the lie detector tests he took. Initially, he presented these tests as proof, as evidence of his innocence. He provided details about the testing process that seemed designed to give credibility to his claims. But now, when pushed about other parts of his story, he's downplaying the importance of the polygraph results and focusing on technical details about how the tests are done. This shift in emphasis suggests that the results may not have been as favorable as he initially claimed, or that he's realized that polygraph evidence isn't as powerful as he originally thought. What ties all of these contradictions together is a pattern of behavior that investigators see frequently in cases involving deception. When someone is telling the truth, their story remains consistent over time. Details might be added as memory is refreshed, but core facts don't change. When someone is lying, however, they have to remember not just what actually happened, but also what they said happened. As time passes and pressure mounts, it becomes increasingly difficult to keep all the lies straight. That's exactly what we're seeing with Daniel Martel. His story is falling apart under the weight of its own inconsistencies. But what makes this even more tragic is that while Daniel is focused on managing his public image and defending himself against criticism, 2 children remain missing. Lily and Jack Sullivan are still out there somewhere, and every day that passes without finding them makes their safe return less likely. The community volunteers who continue searching for these children, people like Tint, who obtained that explosive recording, are focused on what matters. They're not worried about public opinion or legal issues. They're worried about finding 2 innocent children and bringing them home. Daniel Martel would do well to follow their example. But based on his recent behavior, it seems more likely that he'll continue down this path of contradictions and misdirection until the truth finally catches up with him. And that truth may be closer than he thinks. How do you feel about these contradictions? Are you seeing the pattern I'm describing? And what do you think Daniel's next move will be as the evidence continues to mount against him? Of all the contradictions in Daniel Martel's changing story, none is more damaging or more revealing than his complete reversal regarding the evidence found near Gearlock Road. This isn't just another inconsistency in a long list of falsehoods. This is Daniel Martel unknowingly providing information that only someone involved in placing that evidence would have. Let's start with what Daniel originally said about the blanket evidence because his initial response was actually quite reasonable and appeared to support the investigation. On June 19, 2025, multiple news sources reported that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police had shown Daniel several items found during the search near Gearlock Road. These items included shirts, a blanket, and a water bottle. The police wanted Daniel and Malaya to identify whether any of these items belonged to Lilly or Jack. Daniel's response at that time was clear and definite. He confirmed that the blanket was a piece of Lilly's blanket. Not that it looked similar or might be hers, but that it was definitively hers. Malaya also confirmed this identification. This was exactly the kind of cooperation you would expect from innocent people who genuinely wanted to help find missing children. They were providing helpful information to investigators, confirming evidence that could be crucial to the case. Daniel even went further than just identifying the evidence. He made statements to the media indicating that there was additional evidence that hadn't been released to the public yet. He said, "There is more evidence than the public knows." This statement suggested that Daniel was privy to information about the investigation that the general public wasn't aware of. It implied ongoing cooperation with law enforcement and knowledge of evidence beyond what had been publicly reported. For someone who claims to be innocent, this was exactly the right approach. He was helping investigators, providing useful information, and supporting the search effort in concrete ways. But then something changed. As pressure mounted on Daniel, as his story began to fall apart in other areas, as new claims surfaced about his treatment of the children, he suddenly developed a completely different theory about this same evidence. Now, instead of confirming that the blanket belonged to Lilly, Daniel is suggesting that all of the evidence was placed there. In his recent messages, he's making statements that reveal far more than he probably intended to reveal. Who searched for 20 minutes and found it, he asks. It doesn't fly to where the boot print was located 1,000 feet away. Come on. Who happens to stumble up on it? Let's break down what Daniel is actually saying here because this is where his desperation leads him to unknowingly reveal something. First, he's questioning how quickly the evidence was found. Who searched for 20 minutes and found it? This suggests that Daniel believes the evidence should have been harder to find, that it was located too easily to be real. But how would Daniel know how difficult it should have been to find unless he knew where it was supposed to be? How would he have expectations about search timing unless he had knowledge about the evidence placement? Second, he's making specific statements about distances and locations. It doesn't fly to where the boot print was located 1,000 feet away. This reveals detailed knowledge about the relationship between different pieces of evidence and their locations. Again, how would Daniel have this specific knowledge unless he was involved in placing the evidence? Innocent people don't typically have detailed information about evidence locations and their relationship to each other. Third, and most damaging of all, he's asking who happens to stumble up on it, with the clear implication that it was too convenient to be legitimate. But here's the critical point. Daniel wasn't present during the search when this evidence was found. According to his own previous statements, he was away from the house during the initial search efforts. So, how does he know the circumstances under which the evidence was discovered? The only way Daniel would know these details is if he was involved in placing the evidence, or if he had detailed conversations with someone who was involved in placing it. Then Daniel makes the statement that is maybe the most revealing thing he said throughout this entire investigation. A blanket doesn't grow wings. This isn't the statement of someone who suspects evidence was placed there on purpose. This is the statement of someone who knows with certainty that evidence was placed because he was involved in it. Think about the language he's using. A blanket doesn't grow wings implies that he knows exactly how that blanket got from one location to another. It implies knowledge of the transportation method and timing. Innocent people who suspect evidence tampering might say things like, "I think someone moved that evidence," or "That seems suspicious to me." They don't make definitive statements about the physics of evidence movement unless they have specific knowledge about how the movement occurred. But Daniel goes even further. In another message, he states, "We all know who planted it, guys. We all know. not "I suspect" or "it seems like" or "maybe someone." "We all know" is someone speaking from personal knowledge, not speculation. This is someone who is part of a group that has specific information about evidence placement. The pronoun usage here is particularly revealing. When Daniel says "we," he's inadvertently including himself in the group of people who know how the evidence was placed. He's not speaking as an outside observer who suspects tampering. He's speaking as an insider who has direct knowledge. But perhaps the most damaging aspect of Daniel's evidence placement theory is that it directly contradicts his own previous statements about cooperating with the investigation. Remember, Daniel originally confirmed that the blanket belonged to Lilly. He made statements about there being more evidence than the public knew. He presented himself as someone who was working with investigators to find the children. Now, he's claiming that same evidence was put there. This means one of two things. Either Daniel was lying when he confirmed the evidence was legitimate, or he's lying now when he claims it was placed. In either case, he's shown that he's willing to mislead law enforcement and the public about crucial evidence in a missing children's case. But there's actually a third possibility that's even more troubling. What if Daniel was telling the truth both times? What if he did confirm that the blanket belonged to Lilly because it actually did belong to Lilly? And what if he's now saying it was placed there because he knows that he's the one who placed it? This would explain his detailed knowledge about the evidence placement, his certainty about the placement, and his use of "we" when describing who knows about the placement. It would also explain why he's so confident that the evidence was placed while simultaneously having confirmed its authenticity. If Daniel took Lilly's blanket and placed it near Gearlock Road himself, then both statements could be technically true. The blanket would genuinely belong to Lilly, which is why he could confirm its authenticity, but it would also be placed there, which is why he knows with certainty that it was moved there artificially. This interpretation is consistent with all of Daniel's statements and explains the contradictions that seem impossible to reconcile otherwise. It also fits with the timeline Daniel has provided about his activities during the initial search period. He admits he was away from the house for extended periods during the first and second days after the children were reported missing. What was he doing during those absences? According to his own statements, he was available to place evidence in locations where it would eventually be found by search teams. The location near Gearlock Road where the evidence was found is approximately 1 kilometer from the Sullivan home. That's easily within walking distance, certainly within ATV range, and wouldn't require significant time or planning to access. If Daniel wanted to create evidence that would support a theory that the children had wandered off or been taken by someone else, placing items of their clothing or personal belongings in a location where searchers would find them would be a logical strategy. But what Daniel didn't anticipate was that his own statements about the evidence would eventually be used against him. He didn't realize that his detailed knowledge about evidence placement would reveal his involvement rather than support his innocence. This is why experienced investigators often allow suspects to talk freely and extensively. The more someone lies, the more contradictions they create, and eventually those contradictions become impossible to explain away. Daniel Martel appears to have reached that point. His statements about the blanket evidence have created a logical trap that he cannot escape. Either he was lying to investigators when he confirmed the evidence was legitimate, or he's lying now when he claims it was placed, or he's unknowingly revealing to have placed legitimate evidence himself. None of these options support his claim of innocence. Part 4. Messages from a Desperate Man. The text messages that Daniel Martel has been releasing tell a story that he probably doesn't realize he's telling. They paint a picture of someone who is becoming increasingly desperate as his carefully constructed narrative begins to collapse under scrutiny. What makes these messages particularly revealing is not just what Daniel says but how he says it, when he chooses to release them, and what topics he focuses on versus what he avoids discussing entirely. When someone is genuinely innocent of a crime, their communications typically follow predictable patterns. They focus on the victim, they cooperate with authorities, they provide consistent information, and they avoid creating unnecessary drama or controversy. Daniel's messages follow a completely different pattern. They're reactive rather than proactive, defensive rather than helpful, and they consistently deflect attention away from the missing children and onto his own perceived victimization. Let's examine the most recent batch of messages that Daniel released because they reveal a mindset that is fundamentally incompatible with innocence. The first message that stands out is Daniel's statement. "There's no one else to target other than me and my mom because they hide." This single sentence reveals several critical things about Daniel's understanding of the situation. First, he acknowledges that he's being targeted by the investigation. This isn't the language of someone who sees themselves as a witness or someone trying to help find missing children. This is the language of someone who sees themselves as a suspect. Second, he suggests that there are other people who should be investigated, but they're hiding. This implies that Daniel knows who these people are and knows that they're avoiding scrutiny. How would Daniel have this knowledge unless he was involved in whatever happened to Lilly and Jack? Third, he includes "my mom" in the group being targeted. This suggests that Janie, Daniel's mother, is also under investigation or suspicion. Why would Daniel's mother be involved in this case unless there's more to the family's involvement than Daniel has admitted? The next message that's particularly revealing is Daniel's claim. "I've been vocal since the start about finding the kids. We all decide. Lilly and Jack are the only goal I have." The problem with this statement is that it's demonstrably false. Daniel hasn't been vocal about finding the kids. He's been vocal about defending himself. There's a crucial difference. Look at the content of his messages over the past 3 months. How many of them focus on search efforts, potential leads, or helpful information for investigators? How many focus on complaints about his treatment, attacks on critics, or defensive explanations for his behavior? The ratio tells the real story. Daniel is far more interested in managing his public image than in finding Lilly and Jack. When Daniel claims, "Lilly and Jack are the only goal I have," his actions contradict his words. Someone whose only goal was finding missing children wouldn't be spending time releasing defensive text messages, engaging in social media arguments, or changing their story about evidence. They would be cooperating fully with investigators, providing any information that might be helpful, and staying out of the public eye to avoid interfering with the investigation. But perhaps the most damaging message in this latest batch is Daniel's statement about the evidence. "We all know who planted it, guys." We've already discussed the implications of this statement in terms of the evidence itself, but there's another layer that's worth examining. Look at the casual, almost boastful tone Daniel uses here. "We all know who planted it, guys." This isn't someone who is horrified by the possibility that evidence was tampered with. This isn't someone who is concerned about the implications for the investigation. This is someone who seems almost pleased to have this information, someone who wants to share what he knows. Why would Daniel be pleased about evidence being placed there unless he was involved in it? Why would he want to publicize this information unless he thought it helped his case somehow? The answer suggests that Daniel doesn't fully understand the legal implications of what he's saying. He seems to think that proving evidence was placed there will clear his name, not realizing that his detailed knowledge about the placement actually suggests his involvement further. Another message that reveals Daniel's mindset is his complaint about people not believing him. "Do you know how supportive we would be if he wasn't lying over and over? Very provable lies. Very provable." What's striking about this message is that Daniel seems genuinely surprised that people don't believe him. He appears to think that his lies haven't been obvious, that people should be accepting his explanations at face value. This suggests a level of self-deception that is common among people who commit serious crimes. They become so invested in their own narrative that they lose sight of how transparent their deception has become to others. Daniel's reference to very provable lies is also significant. He's acknowledging that he's been caught in lies, but he's trying to minimize their importance. This is classic behavior. Admit to small lies to try to maintain credibility about bigger lies. The problem for Daniel is that once you've shown a willingness to lie about some aspects of a case, everything you say becomes suspect. If you'll lie about small things, why should anyone believe you about big things? Perhaps most revealing of all are the messages where Daniel starts blaming Malaya for various problems. In his latest communications, he's suggesting that Malaya was responsible for some issues in the household. This represents a significant shift in Daniel's strategy. For months, he's been presenting a united front with Malaya, suggesting that they were both victims of unfair suspicion. Now, suddenly, he's trying to distance himself from her and shift blame onto her. This kind of blame shifting typically happens when someone realizes their situation is becoming desperate. When the evidence is mounting and the lies are becoming impossible to maintain, people often try to save themselves by sacrificing their co-conspirators. The fact that Daniel is now willing to throw Malaya under the bus suggests that he's realized his original strategy isn't working. He's moving into self-preservation mode, which often means that more damaging revelations are coming. What makes this blame shifting particularly significant is the timing. Daniel waited until after the explosive horse trailer recording surfaced to start distancing himself from Malaya. This suggests that the recording contained information that made Daniel realize he needed to change tactics. What was in that recording that made Daniel suddenly decide that Malaya was expendable? What did he learn about the family's knowledge of his behavior that made him realize he needed to start pointing fingers? The answers to these questions may be more disturbing than anything we've heard so far, but perhaps the most telling aspect of Daniel's recent messages is what he doesn't say. Notice that he never directly addresses the allegations about mistreatment. He never explains why the house was allegedly in poor condition. He never accounts for the CPS visit in December or explains what that was about. Instead, he focuses on technical aspects of evidence collection, legal procedures, and abstract complaints about fairness. These are deflection tactics designed to avoid discussing the substance of the allegations against him. When someone is innocent, they address accusations directly. They provide explanations. They offer evidence of their innocence. They answer questions honestly and completely. When someone is not innocent, they do exactly what Daniel is doing. They deflect. They attack the messenger. They change the subject. And they hope that if they create enough confusion and controversy, people will lose sight of the original allegations. But Daniel has miscalculated. Each deflection, each contradiction, each desperate attempt to control the narrative only makes his situation more obvious. The community hasn't lost sight of what matters. Volunteers like Tint are still focused on finding Lily and Jack. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police are still building their case methodically and thoroughly, and Daniel's own words are providing them with the evidence they need to hold him accountable for whatever happened to those two innocent children. There's something fundamentally important that every investigator learns early in their career. When someone is telling the truth about events, the details they provide will be consistent with known facts about time, place, weather, and circumstances. When someone is lying, they often include details that seem reasonable in isolation, but fall apart when examined against objective reality. Daniel Martel's explanation of his activities on the night before Lily and Jack disappeared is a perfect example of this principle. His story might sound plausible if you don't think about it too carefully. But when you examine it against the facts we know about Nova Scotia weather, seasonal activities, and basic common sense, it becomes clear that Daniel is not being truthful about what he was really doing that night. Let's start with Daniel's claim about what he and Malaya were doing the evening before the children disappeared. According to Daniel, they were working on a fence and preparing for pool installation. These sound like normal springtime activities for a family getting ready for summer. But there's a problem. The children disappeared around May 1st. In Nova Scotia, May 1st is not pool preparation season. Anyone who lives in the maritime provinces knows that early May is unpredictable at best. Daytime temperatures might reach the mid-teens C on a good day, but nighttime temperatures often drop close to freezing. It's common to have frost warnings in early May, and snow is not unheard of. This is not weather for outdoor pool preparation. Most outdoor pools in Nova Scotia don't even consider opening until late May or early June, and many don't actually open until after the Victoria Day weekend in late May. So why would Daniel and Malaya be preparing for a pool installation in early May? It doesn't make practical sense, and it suggests that Daniel is either not being truthful about what they were doing, or he's made up this entire story to account for time that was actually spent on something else. The fence work claim is equally problematic. While fence work can theoretically be done in various weather conditions, Daniel specifically mentioned working on this project in the evening hours before the children disappeared. Early May evenings in Nova Scotia are cold, often requiring heavy jackets or coats. They're also short. Sunset comes around 7:30 p.m., and it gets dark quickly after that. This is not an ideal time for outdoor construction projects. More importantly, fence installation or repair typically requires specific tools, materials, and planning. You need post-hole diggers, concrete, lumber, hardware, and often permits depending on the type of fence and its location. Daniel has never mentioned obtaining any of these materials or doing any of the preparation work that would be necessary for a fence project. He's never explained what type of fence they were installing, where it was being installed, or why it was urgent enough to work on it in poor weather conditions. This suggests that the fence work, like the pool preparation, is a made-up explanation for time that was actually spent on something Daniel doesn't want to discuss. But what makes Daniel's timeline even more suspicious is that he's been inconsistent about these activities in his various statements. In some versions of his story, he emphasizes the fence work. In others, he focuses on the pool preparation. In still others, he mentions both, but in different orders or with different levels of detail. When someone is telling the truth about activities they actually performed, they typically provide consistent details across multiple tellings. The basic facts remain the same even if minor details are added or emphasized differently. When someone is not truthful about activities, they often change details between tellings because they're making up the story as they go rather than remembering actual events. Daniel's changing emphasis and inconsistent details suggest that he's creating this story rather than recounting it. There's another problem with Daniel's timeline that goes beyond weather considerations. He claims that Malaya was normal the night before the children disappeared, that she put the kids to bed as usual, and that they worked together on these outdoor projects. But if Daniel and Malaya were engaged in evening outdoor work, when exactly did Malaya put the children to bed? Young children typically have bedtime routines that happen in the early evening hours. 6-year-old Lily and 3-year-old Jack would likely have been going to bed between 7 o'clock and 8 o'clock p.m. This would conflict directly with Daniel's claims about evening fence and pool work. You can't be working outside on construction projects and simultaneously supervising children's bedtime routines. Daniel has never explained how these activities were coordinated or who was responsible for the children while the outdoor work was happening. This suggests that his story about the evening activities is incomplete at best, fabricated at worst. But perhaps the most significant problem with Daniel's timeline is what it reveals about his priorities and mindset. Even if we accept that fence and pool work was happening despite the weather problems and timing issues, what does this tell us about Daniel's relationship with the children? According to Daniel's own story, he spent the last evening before Lily and Jack disappeared focused on property maintenance rather than spending time with the children. He didn't mention reading bedtime stories, helping with homework, playing games, or any of the activities that loving step-parents typically engage in with young children. Instead, he portrays himself as being focused on outdoor projects that could have been done at any time, but happened to be prioritized over family time on what would turn out to be the last night these children were seen alive. This doesn't sound like the behavior of someone who genuinely cared about these children as much as Daniel claims he did. There's also the question of what Daniel and Malaya were really preparing for. If they weren't actually doing fence and pool work, what were they doing that required an alternative explanation? One possibility that has been suggested by observers of this case is that Daniel and Malaya were preparing for something they knew was going to happen. They might have been making arrangements, moving items, or taking other steps related to a plan they had already formulated. This interpretation would explain why Daniel needs an alternative explanation for his activities that night. If he was actually preparing to harm the children or hide evidence, he would need to account for his time in a way that seemed innocent and normal. Fence work and pool preparation would be exactly the kind of activities that would explain away time spent on property maintenance or moving around outdoor areas without arousing suspicion. This interpretation is also consistent with the physical evidence that has been found. If Daniel was preparing locations where evidence would later be placed or where the children's remains might be hidden, he would need to scout these areas and possibly prepare them in advance. The location near Gearlock Road where the blanket was found is exactly the kind of area that might require advanced preparation. It's remote enough to avoid immediate discovery, but accessible enough for someone with local knowledge to reach. Daniel's claimed activities on the night before the disappearance would have provided perfect cover for this kind of preparation work. Another aspect of Daniel's timeline that raises questions is his emphasis on Malaya's behavior. He repeatedly mentions that Malaya was normal that night, that she put the children to bed as usual, that there was nothing unusual about her demeanor. Why is Daniel so focused on establishing Malaya's normalcy? Why is it important to his story that people believe Malaya was acting normally? One possibility is that Daniel is trying to preemptively counter evidence that Malaya was actually distressed, nervous, or behaving unusually that night. If neighbors or other witnesses observed Malaya acting strangely, Daniel's emphasis on her normalcy would be an attempt to discredit those observations. Another possibility is that Daniel is trying to establish that Malaya was unaware of what was going to happen to the children. If Daniel was planning something that night, he might want to portray Malaya as an innocent participant who had no knowledge of his intentions. But there's a third possibility that's even more disturbing. Daniel's emphasis on Malaya's normalcy might be an attempt to suggest her involvement further. By establishing that she was behaving normally while allegedly participating in fence and pool work, Daniel might be setting up a narrative where Malaya was an active and willing participant in whatever actually happened that night. This would be consistent with Daniel's recent strategy of shifting blame onto Malaya and distancing himself from her actions. What makes Daniel's timeline claims even more problematic is that they've never been corroborated by independent witnesses. Daniel claims that he and Malaya were working with Mom on these projects, but there's no indication that this has been confirmed by other family members. If Janie, Daniel's mother, was actually present during these activities, she would be able to provide specific details about what was done, when it was done, and under what conditions. The fact that we haven't heard this confirmation suggests that either the activities didn't happen as described or the other participants aren't willing to support Daniel's version of events. This lack of corroboration is particularly significant given that family members would typically be eager to support an innocent relative's alibi. The silence from other family members suggests that they either don't believe Daniel's story or they know information that contradicts it. And what do you think Daniel and Malaya were really doing that night that requires this elaborate cover story? There's a lot to consider in this case, from the shifting stories about evidence to the changing claims about timelines and family dynamics. As we've looked at the details, what stands out most to you? If you were in a position to help decode this situation, what questions would you ask and what actions would you take to bring clarity to the search for Lily and Jack?